Anne Weatherby stood at the threshold of the Asheford ballroom, her gloved hands clasped tightly before her. The golden chandeliers cast their flickering light across a sea of silk gowns and tailored evening coats, creating an atmosphere of opulence that felt suffocating rather than welcoming. She had not wanted to come. Every instinct warned her that her presence here would draw exactly the kind of attention she had spent 2 years trying to avoid. But her younger sister's debut could not be ignored, and family duty demanded her attendance, even if society would rather she remain invisible. The whispers began almost immediately. Anne felt them like pinpricks against her skin as she moved through the crowd. Women turned their fans to conceal their mouths while their eyes tracked her progress across the polished floor. Men pretended not to notice her, though their studied indifference was perhaps more damning than outright hostility would have been. A separated woman occupied a peculiar limbo in Regency society. She was neither properly married nor entirely free, marked by scandal, yet expected to maintain the appearance of respectability. Anne had learned to navigate these treacherous waters with her head held high, though the effort exhausted her more than she cared to admit. She found her sister Margaret near the refreshment table, surrounded by a small group of young women, whose excitement about the evening remained undiminished by Anne's arrival. Margaret's face brightened when she saw her, and Anne felt a surge of protectiveness for this beloved girl who still viewed the world with optimism. At 18, Margaret understood the scandal that had touched their family, but she had not yet learned how deeply society's judgments could cut. Anne intended to shield her from that knowledge for as long as possible. The orchestra struck up a country dance, and Anne retreated to the periphery of the ballroom where the matrons and wallflowers typically gathered. She had no expectation of dancing tonight. Her role was to observe, to ensure Margaret's evening proceeded smoothly, and then to disappear back to the modest townhouse they now called home. The grand estate in Yorkshire where Anne had grown up, the rolling hills and ancient forest she had loved, all of that belonged to Arthur Millstone now. That loss still ached like a wound that refused to heal properly. Anne was so absorbed in watching Margaret laugh with her friends that she did not immediately notice the shift in the room's atmosphere. It began subtly, a ripple of awareness that moved through the crowd like wind across water. Conversations faltered, heads turned toward the entrance, and then Anne saw him. Arthur Millstone had arrived. Her former husband cut an impressive figure. She could admit that much without emotion clouding her judgment. Tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair carefully styled and evening clothes tailored to perfection. Arthur knew how to command a room. He also knew how to weaponize charm, deploying his smile with the precision of a practiced duelist. Anne had once believed that smile was genuine, that the attention he lavished upon her during their brief courtship stemmed from authentic affection. She had been young and foolish, dazzled by the prospect of marriage to a man who seemed to offer everything her romantic heart desired. The truth had revealed itself quickly enough after their wedding. Arthur's interest had never been in Anne herself. He had wanted the Weatherby lands, the prosperous estate her father had built through decades of careful stewardship. When her father's will revealed that the property would pass to Anne's future son rather than to her husband directly, Arthur's mask had slipped. The man she thought she knew vanished, replaced by someone cold, calculating, and ultimately cruel. Anne had endured 18 months of marriage before she could bear it no longer. The separation had cost her dearly. Her reputation lay in tatters. Her dowry was consumed by legal fees, and she lost her beloved home when Arthur's subsequent legal maneuvering forced its sale to cover debts she later suspected he had manufactured. But she had gained something invaluable in return: her freedom, her self-respect, the knowledge that she would never again allow any man to control her fate. Now Arthur moved through the ballroom with the easy confidence of someone who believed himself untouchable. His gaze swept the crowd, acknowledging greetings and accepting congratulations on some recent business success Anne neither knew nor cared about. She willed herself to remain perfectly still, hoping that if she did not move, did not draw attention, he might not notice her presence. It was a futile hope. Arthur had always possessed an uncanny ability to sense vulnerability, and he had spent 2 years nursing his resentment over the fact that Anne had escaped him. Their eyes met across the room. Anne saw the moment recognition flared in Arthur's expression, followed immediately by something darker: satisfaction, anticipation, the look of a predator who had just spotted prey. He altered his course, moving deliberately in her direction, and Anne felt her heart begin to pound. She could leave, she supposed, but that would look like retreat. It would give him exactly the satisfaction he sought. So she remained where she was, lifting her chin slightly and meeting his gaze with as much composure as she could summon. Arthur stopped directly in front of her, close enough that his presence felt intrusive. Several nearby conversations faltered, as people sensed the tension crackling between them. He smiled, but there was nothing warm in the expression. It was the smile of someone about to deliver a calculated blow. "Anne," he said, his voice carrying just far enough that others could hear. "What a surprise to see you here. I had not realized the Ashfords were extending their invitations quite so broadly this season." The insult was clear. Anne was not the sort of person who should receive invitations to respectable gatherings. Her presence here was an aberration, a mistake in judgment by their hosts. She felt heat rise to her cheeks, but kept her voice steady when she replied. "My sister is making her debut this evening. Surely even you would not suggest that a sister should miss such an occasion?" Arthur's smile widened. "Ah, yes, young Margaret. Such a sweet girl. One hopes her prospects will not be damaged by unfortunate associations." He paused, letting that threat hang in the air between them. Then he continued, raising his voice slightly so that more of the surrounding crowd could hear. "Tell me, Anne, are you still residing in that charming little townhouse in the unfashionable part of Marylebone? I do hope the accommodations are adequate for someone of your former station." Anne felt the words like physical blows. He was systematically dismantling her dignity, reminding everyone present that she had fallen from grace, that she now lived in reduced circumstances while he prospered. She knew she should walk away, but pride held her in place. She would not give him the satisfaction of seeing her flee. "My circumstances are my own concern," she said quietly, "just as your business dealings and social arrangements are yours. I believe we agreed 2 years ago that we would have nothing further to do with one another. Did we?" Arthur's tone was light, conversational, but his eyes were cold. "I confess I remember things rather differently. I remember a wife who abandoned her vows and her responsibilities, a woman who brought scandal upon both our families through her selfishness and unwillingness to compromise." The unfairness of that characterization stole Anne's breath. She had endured Arthur's cruelty, his indifference, his barely concealed contempt for months before finally accepting that their marriage was destroying her. The separation had been her only option for survival. But Arthur had spent the past 2 years constructing a narrative in which he was the wounded party, the faithful husband betrayed by an unreasonable wife. And society, always eager to blame a woman for the failure of a marriage, had largely accepted his version of events. Anne opened her mouth to respond, though she had no idea what she could say that would not make things worse. But before she could speak, Arthur delivered his final devastating blow. He looked around at the crowd that had gathered to watch their exchange, ensuring he had maximum attention, and then spoke with cruel clarity. "What are you doing here, Anne? This is not a place where separated women should be. Who would ever marry a woman like you?" The question hung in the air like a pronouncement of execution. Anne felt the room's attention focus on her with unbearable intensity. The whispers that had followed her entrance became a roar in her ears. She saw pity in some faces, satisfaction in others, and worst of all, agreement. Arthur had articulated what many in this room already believed. She was damaged goods, a cautionary tale, a woman who had forfeited her right to respect or consideration. Anne's vision began to narrow, black spots dancing at the edges as she struggled to breathe normally. She would not cry. She would not give Arthur or anyone else that satisfaction. But she could feel her composure crumbling, could sense that she was moments away from a humiliation that would echo through society for years to come. Margaret's debut would be ruined. Her sister's prospects would be tainted by association with scandal. Everything Anne had tried to protect would be destroyed. She took a step backward, preparing to retreat, to flee this room and never return. But before she could move, something extraordinary happened. A hand appeared in her line of vision, a man's hand, extended toward her with calm certainty. Anne's gaze travelled up from that hand to the face of its owner, and she found herself looking into the ice-blue eyes of Duke Frederick Moore. The Duke of Ashton was not a man Anne knew well. Their paths had crossed occasionally over the years at various social functions, but they had never engaged in more than the briefest exchanges of pleasantries. She knew him by reputation primarily. He was considered one of the most powerful men in England, wealthy beyond imagination, connected to the highest levels of government and society. He was also known for his coldness, his unwillingness to suffer fools, and his absolute refusal to involve himself in social drama or scandal. Yet here he stood, his hand extended to her, his expression calm and utterly unreadable. The entire ballroom seemed to hold its breath. "Miss Weatherby," Frederick said, his voice carrying effortlessly across the sudden silence, "would you do me the honor of this dance?" Anne stared at him, unable to immediately process what was happening. The orchestra had just begun a waltz, that most intimate of dances that required partners to maintain close physical contact throughout. For the Duke of Ashton to request a waltz with her, here, now, in front of everyone, was unprecedented. It was also, she realized with dawning comprehension, a deliberate choice. Frederick Moore was not rescuing her out of kindness or sentiment. Anne could see that clearly in his steady gaze. This was a calculated move, though she did not yet understand its purpose. But whatever his motivation, he was offering her a lifeline, an escape from Arthur's humiliation, a statement to everyone present that she was not as utterly without support or value as her former husband wanted them to believe. Anne placed her hand in his. His grip was firm and warm, anchoring her to reality as he led her onto the dance floor. She could feel every eye in the room tracking their progress, could sense the frantic whispers beginning as people tried to make sense of what they were witnessing. Arthur stood frozen where she had left him, his expression cycling through shock, confusion, and mounting anger. Frederick positioned them for the waltz with practiced ease, one hand settling at her waist, while maintaining the propriety required by even this relatively modern dance. As the music swelled and they began to move, Anne finally found her voice. "Your Grace, I do not understand why you—" "There is no need to understand," Frederick interrupted quietly. "Simply follow my lead." Anne had learned to waltz years ago, though she had rarely practiced the skill during her brief, unhappy marriage. But Frederick moved with such confidence that it was easy to match his steps, to let him guide her through the familiar patterns. They danced in silence for several measures, and Anne used that time to study the man who had so unexpectedly intervened on her behalf. The Duke of Ashton was perhaps 5 years older than Anne's 26, though his bearing made him seem older still. He possessed the kind of aristocratic features that could be called handsome, with high cheekbones, a strong jaw, and those remarkable pale eyes that seemed to miss nothing. His dark hair was touched with silver at the temples, and there was a hardness to his expression that suggested he had seen too much of the world's ugliness to maintain any illusions about human nature. "I know Arthur Millstone," Frederick said abruptly, his voice low enough that only Anne could hear him over the music. "We have been on opposite sides of several business and political disputes over the past few years. The man is a scoundrel, though a clever one. He manufactures debt, manipulates contracts, and uses the law as a weapon against those less powerful than himself." Anne's surprise must have shown on her face, because Frederick's mouth curved slightly. It was not quite a smile, but it suggested grim amusement. "Did you think you were his only victim?" Frederick asked. "Millstone has left a trail of ruined men and women in his wake. He lacks honor, and he preys upon those who trust too easily. I have been seeking a way to curtail his influence for some time, but he is careful to keep his activities within the bounds of legality, if not morality." "Then why are you helping me?" Anne asked. "If your dispute with Arthur is professional rather than personal, why involve yourself in this public spectacle?" Frederick turned them smoothly, his movements flowing with the music. "Because I despise bullies," he said simply. "And because what Millstone attempted tonight was not merely cruel but cowardly. To humiliate a woman in public, to use her vulnerability as entertainment, speaks to a profound deficiency of character. I will not stand by and watch such behavior without consequence." Anne felt something shift in her chest. This man, this powerful duke she barely knew, had recognized the injustice of Arthur's attack and had chosen to act, not out of sentiment or romance, but out of principle. It was the most extraordinary gesture anyone had made toward her since her separation. "I'm grateful," she said quietly, "more than I can express, but you have made yourself a target by associating with me. Society will talk. They will speculate about your motives and judge you for showing favor to a separated woman." "Let them talk," Frederick said dismissively. "I care very little for the opinions of people whose approval is conditional upon conformity to arbitrary social rules. Those who matter will understand my purpose. Those who do not understand are irrelevant." The waltz continued, carrying them through intricate patterns across the floor. Anne was acutely aware of Arthur watching from the sidelines, his face now settled into a mask of cold fury. She was also aware of the whispers spreading through the crowd like wildfire. By tomorrow morning, every drawing room in London would be discussing the moment when the Duke of Ashton danced with the scandalous Anne Weatherby. The speculation would be intense, the gossip potentially damaging to both of them. As the music approached its crescendo, Frederick leaned slightly closer, his voice barely audible even to Anne. "When this dance ends, I'm going to make a proposal," he said. "You need not accept it immediately. I ask only that you consider it carefully before you refuse." Anne's heart began to pound again, though this time not from fear. "What sort of proposal?" "The sort that will solve several problems at once," Frederick replied cryptically. "Trust me for just a few minutes more." The final notes of the waltz hung in the air, and the other couples on the floor began to separate, the gentlemen bowing to their partners while the ladies curtsied in return. Frederick, however, did not release Anne's hand. Instead, he kept hold of it as he turned to face the assembled crowd. His posture was relaxed, almost casual, but there was steel in his gaze as it swept across the ballroom. The whispers died away. Everyone waited, sensing that something significant was about to happen, but unable to predict its nature. Anne's breath caught in her throat as Frederick raised his voice to address the room. "I have an announcement," he said, his words carrying clearly to every corner of the ballroom. "It concerns Miss Weatherby and myself." Anne felt dizzy. She had no idea what Frederick was about to say, but she understood instinctively that whatever it was would change everything. Her eyes found Margaret in the crowd, saw her sister's worried expression, and wished desperately that she could somehow protect the girl from whatever storm was about to break. Frederick's grip on her hand tightened slightly, offering reassurance or perhaps just a reminder to remain steady. Then he spoke words that Anne never could have anticipated in her wildest imagination. "I am honored to announce that Miss Anne Weatherby has agreed to become my wife." The ballroom erupted. Gasps of shock, cries of disbelief, and excited chatter filled the air as the assembled guests struggled to process what they had just heard. Anne stood frozen, her mind reeling. Frederick had not proposed. He had not asked her permission or even hinted at such an intention. He had simply declared their engagement as an established fact, giving her no opportunity to refuse without causing an even greater scandal than the one he was attempting to resolve. She should have been furious at his high-handed presumption. Instead, she felt a strange calm settling over her. Frederick had said this would solve several problems, and she could already see the truth of that statement. A betrothal to the Duke of Ashton would instantly restore her social standing. It would protect Margaret's prospects and ensure that Arthur could never again publicly humiliate her. It would place her under the protection of one of the most powerful men in England, someone who had just demonstrated both his willingness to defy social convention and his strategic brilliance. Anne's gaze shifted to Arthur, who stood pale and rigid near the edge of the crowd. His carefully constructed revenge had been demolished in a matter of minutes. Instead of witnessing her humiliation and ruin, he was watching her elevation to a position far above his own reach. The fury in his eyes was almost frightening in its intensity, but there was nothing he could do. To challenge the Duke of Ashton would be social and possibly literal suicide. Frederick turned to Anne, his expression still calm and unreadable. "Shall we greet our well-wishers?" he asked quietly, as though they had not just perpetrated one of the most audacious deceptions in recent social history. Anne found her voice, though it emerged smaller than she would have liked. "Your Grace, We should speak privately about this arrangement." "We will," Frederick assured her, "but first we must play our parts convincingly. The illusion only works if society believes it to be real." He was right, of course. Whatever doubts or questions Anne harbored would have to wait. For now she needed to smile and accept congratulations and pretend that she had indeed agreed to marry this man who had swept into her disaster of an evening and transformed it into something extraordinary. She straightened her spine, lifted her chin, and prepared to face the crowd with as much grace as she could summon. As people began to surge forward to offer their felicitations, Anne caught one last glimpse of Arthur Millstone. He was leaving, pushing his way through the crowd toward the exit with barely controlled violence in his movements. His humiliation was complete, his revenge thwarted, and his enemy triumphant. Anne should have felt satisfaction at his defeat, but all she felt was exhaustion and a strange sense of anticipation about what would come next. Because she had just become engaged to marry a duke she barely knew, a man who had intervened in her life for reasons she did not fully understand, and she had absolutely no idea what he expected from her in return for this extraordinary gesture. The night that had begun with dread and ended with shocking revelation was merely the first chapter in a story that promised to be far more complex than Anne could have imagined. As Frederick's hand remained steady beneath hers, anchoring her through the chaos of congratulations and exclamations, she understood that her life had just changed irrevocably. Whether that change would lead to salvation or a different kind of trap remained to be seen. 3 days after the announcement that shocked London society, Anne sat in the drawing room of Frederick Moore's Grosvenor Square townhouse and tried not to feel overwhelmed by her surroundings. Everything about the Duke of Ashton's residence spoke of old money and unassailable power, from the priceless paintings adorning the silk-covered walls to the Aubusson carpet beneath her feet. She had grown up in comfortable circumstances, but nothing in her experience had prepared her for this level of wealth and refinement. Frederick entered carrying a leather portfolio, his expression as controlled as it had been during their dance at the Asheford ball. In the days since their public betrothal, Anne had seen him twice briefly, both times with other people present. This was their first truly private conversation, and she felt her nervousness increasing with each passing moment. She had agreed to come here today to discuss the terms of their arrangement, though that agreement had been reached through intermediaries rather than directly between them. "Thank you for coming," Frederick said, settling into a chair across from her. "I apologize for the delay in having this conversation. I thought it best to let the initial excitement settle before we addressed the practicalities of our situation." "Our pretend situation," Anne corrected carefully, "since we both know this engagement is not real." Frederick's eyes met hers with that same unsettling directness she remembered from the ballroom. "Is it not? We announced it publicly. Society has accepted it as fact. Your former husband has been forced to acknowledge it. In what sense is it not real?" Anne felt heat rise to her cheeks. "In the sense that you never actually proposed, Your Grace. You simply declared our engagement without consulting me. I appreciate what you did at the ball, truly, but we both know this cannot actually proceed to marriage. The deception has served its purpose. Surely now we can quietly dissolve the engagement and—" "No," Frederick interrupted. His tone was mild, but there was absolute finality in the single word. "We cannot." Anne stared at him. "What do you mean we cannot?" "Of course we can. Engagements end all the time. We need only cite some polite incompatibility, and society will accept—" "Society will say that I found you wanting," Frederick said bluntly. "They will assume that upon closer acquaintance, I discovered something that made you unsuitable to become a duchess. Your reputation, which I elevated through our betrothal, will be destroyed even more thoroughly than Arthur Millstone attempted. And your sister's prospects, which currently look quite favorable given her connection to my household, will evaporate overnight." Anne's hands clenched in her lap. She had not thought through all the implications, had allowed herself to believe that Frederick's intervention was a temporary shield rather than a permanent transformation of her circumstances. The truth of his words struck her with uncomfortable force. If their engagement ended now, she would be worse off than before. "So what are you suggesting?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Frederick opened his portfolio and withdrew several documents. "I am suggesting that we proceed with an actual marriage. Not a love match, obviously, but a practical arrangement that benefits us both." Anne's laugh emerged bitter and sharp. "What could I possibly offer you? I have no fortune, no connections worth mentioning, and a scandal-marked reputation. You are a duke, Your Grace. You could marry any woman in England. Why would you saddle yourself with me?" "Because I need a wife who will not expect me to love her," Frederick said calmly. "And because the circumstances of our betrothal ensure that society understands this is a marriage of convenience rather than passion. That clarity is valuable to me." Anne studied him with new attention. There was something behind his words, some history or wound that had shaped his perspective on marriage. "You have been pursued for years by ambitious mothers and their daughters," she said slowly. "You could have married any number of suitable women who would have accepted a loveless marriage. Why choose me specifically?" Frederick was silent for a long moment, his fingers steepled before him as he appeared to consider how much to reveal. Finally, he spoke with careful precision. "5 years ago, I was engaged to be married," he said. "Her name was Lydia Hartwell. She was beautiful, accomplished, and came from an excellent family. I believed we understood one another. I was clear from the beginning that while I would fulfill all duties of a husband, I could not offer passionate love. She assured me that she desired only security and position. I believed her." Something in his tone warned Anne that this story did not end well. She remained silent, waiting for him to continue. "2 months before our wedding, Lydia broke our engagement," Frederick said. "She had fallen in love with a younger son who could offer her nothing but affection and poetry. She wrote me a letter, explaining that she could not condemn herself to a cold marriage, that she deserved more than duty and respect. The scandal was considerable, though my rank shielded me from the worst of it. Lydia was not so fortunate." "What happened to her?" Anne asked quietly. "She married her poet," Frederick said. "They moved to the continent and lived, I understand, in moderate poverty, but apparent happiness, until he died of consumption 2 years later. Lydia returned to England, hoping to resume her place in society, but found herself persona non grata among the very people who had once courted her favor. She applied to me for assistance. I gave her a modest pension, but made it clear I had no interest in renewing any connection between us." Anne absorbed this information, beginning to understand the shape of Frederick's proposal. "You want a wife who will not mistake duty for love, who will not expect transformation into some romantic ideal of marriage." "Precisely," Frederick confirmed. "You are recently separated from a man who, by all accounts, made you miserable. You have no illusions about romance or the nobility of masculine character. You need protection and restoration of your social standing. I need a duchess who understands that our marriage is a partnership of mutual advantage, rather than a love story. It seems to me that we are uniquely suited to provide what the other requires." There was logic to his argument, Anne had to admit. A cold, practical logic that left no room for sentiment or foolish hope. She thought about her current situation. The small townhouse in an unfashionable neighborhood, the careful rationing of resources, the constant awareness that one more scandal could destroy what little standing she had managed to preserve. She thought about Margaret, whose debut had gone remarkably well in large part due to her sudden connection to the Duke of Ashton. She thought about Arthur, who even now was probably searching for ways to undermine her newfound security. "What would you expect from me as your wife?" Anne asked. "Beyond the obvious social duties and production of an heir?" Frederick's expression flickered, something that might have been approval crossing his features. "You understand that an heir would be required." "I understand the realities of aristocratic marriage," Anne said dryly. "I may be scandalous, but I am not naive. What else?" Frederick consulted one of his documents. "I would expect you to manage my households with competence and efficiency. I have estates in Northumberland, Yorkshire, and Kent, as well as this London residence. You would have full authority over domestic matters. I would expect you to fulfill the social obligations of a duchess, hosting dinners and attending appropriate functions. I would expect discretion in all things, particularly regarding the private details of our marriage. And I would expect loyalty, not romantic devotion, but the kind of partnership that means we present a united front to the world." "And what would I receive in return?" Anne asked. beyond wealth and social position. Independence within appropriate boundaries, Frederick replied. Your own income controlled by you rather than through me. The freedom to pursue interests and activities that bring you satisfaction, provided they do not reflect poorly on my name. Protection from anyone who might seek to harm you, including Arthur Millstone. And my respect, which I do not give easily, but which, once earned, is absolute. Anne rose from her chair and moved to the window, needing to create some distance as she processed this extraordinary proposal. Below her, Grosvenor Square bustled with the afternoon activities of London's elite. Elegant carriages passed, fashionably dressed women strolled with their maids, and everything looked ordered and secure. She could have that security. She could have the power to protect her sister, to hold her head high in any ballroom, to never again fear what Arthur Millstone or anyone else might do to harm her. All she had to do was marry a man who had just admitted he could not love her. I need time to consider this, Anne said, turning back to face Frederick. I am grateful for your proposal, truly, but this is not a decision I can make impulsively. I understand, Frederick said, rising from his chair. However, I should point out that time is not entirely on your side. With each day that passes, society's expectations about our marriage become more fixed. If you were to refuse me now, the questions would be uncomfortable. If you wait much longer, they would become impossible. How long do I have? Anne asked. A week, Frederick said. After that, we must either begin making concrete plans for a wedding or end the betrothal. I will not press you beyond that point, but I want you to understand the stakes clearly. Anne nodded slowly. A week to decide whether to commit her future to a practical arrangement with a man who offered her everything except the one thing she had once believed essential to marriage. It should have been an easy decision. She had already experienced the disaster of marrying for love, or what she had mistaken for love. Frederick offered her clarity and honesty instead of pretty lies and eventual betrayal. Yet something in her hesitated. Some remnant of the romantic girl she had once been whispered that this was not how her story was supposed to unfold, that she deserved more than a cold business arrangement, even if the alternative was poverty and scandal. I will give you my answer within the week, Anne said finally. I ask that you not contact me during that time. I need space to think clearly without pressure. Agreed, Frederick said, though I should warn you that Arthur Millstone has been making inquiries about our betrothal. He suspects, I think, that it may not be entirely as it appears. If he finds any evidence to support that suspicion, he will use it. Anne felt a chill run down her spine. What sort of inquiries? Nothing specific yet, Frederick assured her. But he has been asking questions about when and where I courted you, trying to establish a timeline that might reveal inconsistencies in our story. I have people monitoring his activities. If he comes close to discovering the truth, I will take steps to neutralize the threat. But it would be better for all concerned if we could present a united front before his investigation gains momentum. Anne understood the unspoken message. Frederick was willing to protect her even if she refused his proposal, but that protection would be more effective and complete if they were actually married. Another pressure, another consideration to weigh in the balance. I should go, Anne said, gathering her gloves and reticule. My sister will be wondering where I am. Frederick escorted her to the door, maintaining the proper distance between them, even as his presence seemed to fill the space. At the threshold, he paused and spoke again. I know this is not what you dreamed of when you were young, he said quietly. Most women imagine their wedding day as the culmination of a great romance. I am offering you something entirely different. But I promise you this, Anne. If you accept my proposal, you will never again be at the mercy of a man who sees you as property to be controlled or destroyed. You will be my duchess, my partner, and my equal in all things that matter. That is worth more than poetry and passion. Anne met his eyes and saw absolute sincerity there. Frederick meant every word he had spoken. He was offering her a real partnership, even if it would be built on practicality rather than love. It was more than Arthur had ever offered her, and perhaps more than she had any right to expect given her circumstances. I will consider everything you have said, Anne promised, and I will give you an honest answer within the week. She left the townhouse and climbed into the modest hired carriage she could barely afford, her mind churning with questions and possibilities. The week that followed proved to be the longest of Anne's life. She thought constantly about Frederick's proposal, weighing every aspect from multiple angles. She made lists of advantages and disadvantages, trying to approach the decision with the same pragmatism that Frederick had demonstrated. But late at night, when logic failed her, she found herself wondering what it would be like to share her life with a man who had made it clear he would never love her. Margaret noticed her distraction and pressed for details about the Duke of Ashton's character. Anne found herself defending Frederick, pointing out his intelligence, his sense of justice, and his straightforward honesty. Her sister listened with the optimism of youth and declared that Anne had been blessed with extraordinary good fortune. Anne did not contradict her, though she wondered if Margaret understood that good fortune sometimes came with complicated strings attached. On the 5th day of her consideration period, Anne received an unexpected visitor. Her landlady announced that a gentleman caller had arrived and was waiting in the small parlour. When Anne descended, she found not Frederick but a man she recognized as Lord Harrington, one of Arthur Millstone's closest associates. "Miss Weatherby," Harrington said with a smile that did not reach his eyes, "how delightful to find you at home. I hope you will forgive the intrusion." Anne remained standing, refusing to invite him to sit. "What do you want, Lord Harrington?" "Merely to express my congratulations on your betrothal," Harrington said smoothly. Such a sudden development. Arthur was quite surprised to learn of it, as I believe you can imagine. He had no idea that you and the Duke of Ashton were acquainted, let alone courting. "My private affairs are no concern of Arthur's," Anne said coldly. "Nor yours." "Of course not," Harrington agreed, though one cannot help but be curious about the timeline. You and Arthur separated less than 2 years ago. The Duke of Ashton has shown no interest in matrimony for years, despite countless young ladies pursuing him. Yet suddenly, at a ball where Arthur happened to speak with you, the Duke appears and sweeps you into a betrothal. It all seems rather convenient. Anne felt her pulse quicken but kept her expression neutral. "Are you suggesting something, Lord Harrington?" "I am suggesting nothing," Harrington said, "merely observing that society loves a romantic story, but it loves the truth even more. If someone were to discover that your betrothal was perhaps not entirely as it appears, the scandal would be extraordinary. The Duke of Ashton might weather it, given his position, but you, Miss Weatherby, you would be destroyed utterly." The threat was clear. Arthur had sent Harrington to intimidate her, to make her understand that he was actively working to expose any deception in her engagement. Anne lifted her chin and met Harrington's gaze with steel in her own. "You may tell Arthur that my betrothal is entirely real," she said firmly. "The Duke and I are planning a wedding for next month. If Arthur chooses to investigate our courtship, he will find only evidence of a man who recognized genuine worth in a woman society had wrongly dismissed. Now I must ask you to leave. I do not receive callers who come bearing veiled threats." Harrington's smile faltered. "I meant no offense. I was merely—" "Leaving," Anne interrupted. "You were merely leaving." She walked to the door and held it open, making her dismissal unmistakable. Harrington departed with poor grace, and Anne closed the door behind him with hands that trembled slightly. The threat Arthur posed was real. If she did not marry Frederick, if their engagement dissolved for any reason, Arthur would ensure that everyone knew it had been false from the beginning. The humiliation would be complete and permanent. Anne sat down in the shabby parlour of her rented townhouse and made her decision. She would marry Frederick Moore, not because she loved him, but because the alternative was unthinkable. She would become a duchess, and she would learn to live within the boundaries of a practical marriage, and perhaps over time she would find that partnership and respect could be enough. She wrote to Frederick that evening, accepting his proposal and requesting that they meet to discuss wedding arrangements. His reply came within hours, expressing satisfaction at her decision and suggesting they begin planning immediately. The wedding would take place in 4 weeks, he wrote, at his estate in Northumberland. It would be a small ceremony, given the circumstances, but it would be conducted properly with all appropriate formality. Anne read his letter and felt the weight of her choice settling over her like a heavy cloak. In 4 weeks, she would become the Duchess of Ashton. She would have wealth, position, and security. She would never again be vulnerable to Arthur Millstone's cruelty or society's judgment. All she had to do was accept that this was enough, that she could build a life within the boundaries of duty and respect, without the complications of love or passion. All she had to do was forget the romantic dreams of her youth and embrace the practical realities of her present circumstances. As Anne prepared for bed that night, she caught sight of her reflection in the small mirror above her washstand. She looked tired, older than her 26 years, but there was determination in her eyes. She had survived her first marriage. She had endured separation and scandal. She would survive this too, and perhaps even find a kind of contentment in the process. The next 4 weeks passed in a whirlwind of activity that left Anne little time for second thoughts. There were meetings with dressmakers, consultations about household arrangements, and endless discussions of protocol and procedure. Frederick proved to be a considerate fiancé in all practical matters, ensuring that Anne had everything she needed and that her preferences were considered in all decisions. He was unfailingly polite, consistently thoughtful, and completely devoid of any romantic gesture or sentiment. Margaret was ecstatic about the upcoming wedding and chattered constantly about how Anne would be the most beautiful duchess in all of England. Anne smiled and accepted her sister's enthusiasm, glad that at least someone could view this marriage with uncomplicated happiness. The wedding itself took place on a crisp autumn morning at the Duke of Ashton's estate in Northumberland. The ceremony was witnessed by a small group of family members and close friends, conducted by the local rector, with proper solemnity. Anne wore a gown of ivory silk that Frederick had insisted on commissioning from London's finest modiste. She carried a bouquet of late-season roses from the estate's gardens. When the rector pronounced them man and wife and Frederick kissed her briefly on the lips, Anne felt a strange mixture of relief and melancholy. She had done it. She had secured her future and her sister's prospects. She had become a duchess, and she had absolutely no idea what would happen next. The first morning Anne woke as the Duchess of Ashton. Northumberland lay under a clear, cold sky, the light pale and sharp, as if the world itself wished to inspect this new reality with unsentimental clarity. She sat up slowly in the wide bed that was now hers, the heavy curtains drawn back to reveal the sweep of the parkland outside. Frost clung to the grass, silvering the ground. Smoke curled from distant chimneys. Somewhere below she could hear the muffled clatter of servants going about their work, the pulse of a great household that had existed long before she came and would continue long after she was gone. Yet for now, this place answered to her. The thought was both exhilarating and terrifying. Her maid, Clara, entered quietly with hot water and a murmured good morning. The girl moved with that careful blend of efficiency and deference that suggested she had been well trained, but her eyes held an alert curiosity whenever they flicked to Anne's face, as if she were still trying to determine what sort of mistress this new duchess would be. Anne allowed herself to be helped into a warm morning gown and a simple arrangement of her hair. Jewelry, elaborate coiffure, and the full armor of society were blessedly unnecessary here. In this house, in these early days of marriage, she needed something more practical than elegance. She needed to observe, to listen, to understand the rhythm of a life she had agreed to share before she had any notion of how it truly moved. By the time she descended to the breakfast room, Frederick was already there. He stood by the long windows reading a letter, the weak winter sunlight catching threads of silver at his temples. The sight of him, so self-contained, so sure, sent a ripple of unfamiliar awareness through her. She had married this man. She bore his name. She would build the rest of her life in the shadow and shelter of his choices. "Good morning," she said, keeping her voice even. He looked up at once and crossed the room with that unhurried stride that always seemed to claim whatever space he occupied without effort. "Good morning," he replied. "Did you sleep well?" "Well enough," she said. "The bed is very comfortable. It may take time for my thoughts to catch up with my circumstances." "A reasonable expectation," he said. "Tea?" He poured for her himself, a small, surprising courtesy that felt more intimate than any formal gesture. They took their seats at the table, a quiet spread of eggs, toast, ham and marmalade between them. The silence that followed should have been awkward. Instead, it felt expectant. "I will give you 2 or 3 days to familiarize yourself with the house at your own pace," Frederick said at length. "After that, I would be grateful if you would meet with Mrs. Winters and the steward to discuss household matters. They are both competent, but the estate has lacked a woman's consistent oversight since my mother's death. It shows." "Of course," Anne said. "I would prefer to understand how things stand before I begin changing anything. Your staff will be more cooperative if they see that I respect their existing systems." "You know how to manage people," he observed. "Not all people," Anne said. "But I understand servants. I was not raised to ignore them." His gaze lingered on her, thoughtful. "Your father sounds more admirable each time you speak of him." "He was," she said softly. "He believed that power was a responsibility, not a toy. He would have liked you, I think." Frederick's mouth curved in a faint, wry smile. "Then I already regret that I never had the opportunity to disappoint him." "He was not easily disappointed," she said, "only by cowardice and cruelty." "Then perhaps I might have escaped his disfavor after all," Frederick replied. It was a small exchange, but something in it loosened a knot in Anne's chest. If they could speak of their families, could connect the past to the present without flinching, perhaps this marriage really could become what they had agreed it would be. A partnership, not merely a shield. The days that followed settled into a pattern. Anne walked the house with Mrs. Winters, listening more than she spoke. She visited the kitchens, the still room, the linen closets, the nursery suite, long unused. She inspected guest chambers and servants' quarters with the same careful attention. Nothing escaped her notice. Worn carpets, a leaky window, a footman whose limp made stairwork painful, a housemaid whose talent for arranging flowers was far beyond ordinary. In the evenings, she and Frederick dined together. At first, their conversation hovered around estate matters and London news, safe topics that never ventured too close to anything deeply personal. But gradually, almost imperceptibly, the edges softened. He asked her opinion on political pamphlets. She teased him about his habit of sorting correspondence into stacks that seemed incomprehensible to anyone but himself. There were even moments of quiet humor, shared in glances rather than elaborate words. On the 10th night of their marriage, she discovered the library. Strictly speaking, she had known of its existence before. It was impossible to live in a house like Ashton Hall and not know. But until then, she had viewed it as his space, a private sanctuary where the Duke withdrew, shuttered behind shelves of leather and thought. That evening, she found the door ajar, and, acting on impulse she might have resisted in another life, she entered. The room was vast and warm, bookshelves rising from polished floor to coffered ceiling. A fire burned low on the hearth. The smell of leather, paper, and faint pipe tobacco wrapped around her like an old familiar cloak. It was the sort of room her father would have adored, the sort her first husband had despised as a foolish indulgence. Frederick sat at a desk near the windows, a sheaf of papers before him. He looked up immediately at her step, but there was no irritation in his face, only mild surprise. "I hope I am not intruding," Anne said, pausing just inside the door. "That depends," he replied. "Do you feel intruded upon when I enter your morning room?" She blinked. "Of course not." "Then the matter is settled," he said. "This house is as much yours as mine. The same holds true of its rooms." "You spend a great deal of time here," she said, moving slowly between the aisles of books. "It feels like you." "A terrible indictment," he said dryly. "All this dust." She smiled despite herself. Not dust, thought, quiet, order. The sense that nothing within these walls will cry out for attention unless you choose to attend to it. "That," he said, setting down his pen, "is precisely why I like it." Her fingers brushed lightly against the spines as she passed. Titles in Latin, Greek, French, and English, histories, treatises, plays, poetry. She stopped at a familiar volume, her hand lingering. Frederick watched her with that intent, unreadable gaze she was coming to recognize. "You know that one?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "My father loved it. I read it to him when his eyes grew weaker." "You miss him," Frederick said, not as a question. "Every day," she replied simply. Silence stretched between them, not empty but full of something they were still learning how to name. After a moment, he gestured to the chessboard arranged on a small table near the fire. "Do you play?" "Yes," she said, "though I am out of practice." "Then you have an advantage over me," he replied. "I am very much in practice and thus ripe for humiliation." The jest was so gentle she almost missed it. She accepted the invitation and took the chair opposite him. The pieces were already in position, mid-game. He reset them without comment, letting her see his hands, long-fingered, steady as they moved the ivory and ebony. They began to play. At first, their conversation centered on the game itself. When she sacrificed her knight to trap his queen, he lifted a brow. "Bold," he said. "Necessary," she answered. "I find boldness often is." "And has it always served you well?" he asked. "Not always," she said, "but I regret most the times I allowed fear to keep me from it." He was silent for a moment as he considered his next move. Fear of what? "Loss," she said without embellishment, "of reputation, of security, of the illusion that the life I was living was the one I truly wanted." "When did you stop fearing that?" he asked. She moved a pawn, deliberately simple. "The night you asked me to dance and then did not ask at all before announcing our engagement. It was a terrifying relief. I did not have to choose publicly. You chose for us both. After that, any choice I made was for myself alone." "And yet," he said quietly, "you did choose. You could have refused the marriage afterward, whatever the cost." "You did not." "No," she agreed, "I did not." "Why?" he asked. Her rook cut across the board, clean and decisive. "Check." He glanced down, then back up at her, impressive and evasive. "Evasion is a tactic," she said. "As for your question, I chose you because you were honest about what you could and could not offer. Arthur promised me love and gave me ownership. You promised me respect and delivered it." "And is that enough?" he asked, just above a whisper. "For now," Anne said, "respect is more than I had any right to expect from marriage again. Whether it remains enough is not a question we can answer after only 10 days. He inclined his head. "Fairly said." They played on in silence, but the air between them felt subtly altered, as if some long-closed window had been opened a crack. Winter deepened, snow weighed down the trees in the park, and ice formed fragile lace along the edges of the ornamental ponds. Within the walls of Ashton Hall, a different kind of thaw was taking place. Anne's days filled quickly. She oversaw the hiring of 2 additional maids to ease an unfair burden on the existing staff. She instituted a rotation of footmen so that no one was required to stand for hours in drafty halls without relief. She suggested improvements to tenant cottages after touring the village, her practical recommendations relayed to the steward with clear, unemotional authority. Frederick watched all this from a slight distance at first, letting her establish her place without overt interference. But when he did speak of her efforts, his comments were direct and without patronizing surprise. "You have increased efficiency and reduced waste," he said one evening as they reviewed estate accounts together. "The savings are significant." "I did not seek to economize," she replied, "only to align responsibilities with abilities." "The mark of true economy," he said. "You see where people are misapplied and corrected. It is a skill more valuable than most men of business realize." "You see it," she pointed out. "I am not most men of business," he said. That much she could not dispute. Their nights too took on a pattern. Sometimes they parted after dinner, each retreating to separate pursuits. Other evenings found them before the library fire, a book open on each lap, sharing occasional remarks. Once or twice each week, he came to her bedchamber and, without fuss or preamble, knocked softly before entering. He never came without being invited in. He never touched her without asking quietly if something was acceptable. The first time he did so, she had laughed, soft but genuine. "Do you intend to negotiate each kiss like a treaty?" she teased. "If necessary," he replied. "I have learned that assuming consent breeds disaster, in treaties and in marriage." Over time, her laughter during those nights became less about deflecting discomfort and more about shared amusement. The physical side of their union, which she had once resigned herself to enduring, became instead a place of unexpected tenderness. He was attentive, responsive, and unhurried in a way that made it impossible, not to soften toward him. When spring finally pressed winter back, bringing wet earth and shy green shoots, Anne realized with a jolt that somewhere between frost and thaw, her heart had shifted. What had begun as gratitude and respect had deepened into something more dangerous. She cared for him, not as a shield, not as an abstraction, but as the man who listened when she spoke, who trusted her judgment, who had rebuilt her sense of self by treating it as something worth rebuilding. She cared enough that the thought of losing this life, this house, this daily companionship, this quiet, growing intimacy, made her blood run cold. It was in that fragile, newly acknowledged state that the next blow fell. The letter arrived on a day that had begun in deceptive peace. Anne had spent the morning in the walled garden, walking the gravel paths as she considered plans for new plantings. The beds, neglected in recent years, held more potential than present beauty. She knelt to brush aside winter debris, fingers already arranging combinations in her mind. Roses here, lavender there, perhaps a small fountain to mask the distant sounds of work from the stables. She was still there, skirts pinned up out of the damp, when she noticed Clara hurrying toward her, cheeks flushed. "Your Grace," the maid said, slightly out of breath. "His Grace asks if you will join him in the study at once. He said it is urgent." Ice slid down Anne's spine, too swift to be entirely rational. "Is anyone hurt?" "No, ma'am," Clara replied. "At least, he did not say so. Only that it was important." Anne rose, brushed soil from her gloves, and followed the maid back through the house. The corridors seemed longer than usual, the echoes of her steps unnervingly loud. Frederick stood at the window of his study, back rigid, a single sheet of paper crushed in his hand. He turned as she entered, and Anne knew at once that whatever had come, it was no trivial estate nuisance. "What has happened?" she asked. He held out the letter. "From my solicitor. Read it." She took the page. The words swam for a moment before settling into place. A petition, filed by Arthur Millstone with the ecclesiastical court, challenging the validity of their separation, implying fraud, implying that she, Anne, might still be legally bound to Arthur, and therefore that her marriage to Frederick was, in the eyes of the law, bigamous. The room lurched. She gripped the edge of the desk until her knuckles whitened. "He cannot do this," she said. It came out thin, less a declaration than a wish. "He already has," Frederick replied. His voice was very calm, too calm. "But it is nonsense," she said. "The separation was properly handled. The papers are in order," Frederick said. "My solicitor assures me the petition is without merit, but the law is one thing, society is another. A whisper of bigamy, even false, stains like ink." She looked up at him. He was not pale. Frederick never seemed to pale, but there was a flint-like hardness in his features she had seen only once before. The night in the Asheford ballroom when he had quietly overturned Arthur's cruel little play. "This is my past reaching for you," she said slowly. I thought we had outrun it." "Some debts," he said, "do not accept being written off quietly. They insist upon collection, whatever the cost." "And what will the cost be?" she forced herself to ask. He exhaled, a sound between a sigh and a growl. "If we do nothing and this becomes public, your name will be dragged through the mud again. Mine will not escape unscathed. Our enemies will delight in it. Our friends will have to work twice as hard to justify supporting us. Any children we may have will find their legitimacy questioned in whispers, if not in law." Children. The word struck a fragile chord inside her. She had not yet let herself fully imagine them, not because she did not want them, but because wanting felt dangerous. Now that future, too, flickered. "And if we act?" she asked. He began to pace, a measured line from hearth to window and back. "I have been gathering information on Millstone since before our marriage, his business dealings, his debts, his partnerships. I can pull on those threads now and unravel what remains of his reputation, but that would require a very public campaign. The scandal would grow, not shrink. We would win in the end, but the battle would be fought in front of an audience eager for blood." She swallowed. "What alternative is there?" He stopped, turned to face her fully. "A quieter solution. one that uses his arrogance against him, but it requires something I would not ask if there were any other way. Tell me, she said. Whatever it is, I will consider it. You must meet him, Frederick said, privately, or at least in a setting he believes to be private. The very air seemed to recoil at the suggestion. For a heartbeat, Anne could not breathe. No, she said. Then, more calmly, you want me to go to him? Yes, Frederick said. There was pain in the word, as if forcing it out cost him. He will not speak freely with me. He will posture, lie, and hide behind his solicitor's advice. But with you, his pride will not allow him to resist the chance to gloat. He will show his hand, perhaps more than he intends to. And you would be where? She asked, fingers icy. In the next room, he said immediately, hearing everything, ready to act if he so much as raises a hand to you. He has never beaten me, she said dully. He preferred other methods. I do not care, Frederick said, a flash of fury crossing his face. If he harms you in any way, you will do something irrevocable, she finished, which is precisely what we are trying to avoid. He made a rough sound. Anne, I hate this plan. I hate that it requires asking you to face him again, but I see no better way to end his hold over you without burning everything else with him. What would you have me do? She asked. What would I say? He came around the desk and stood closer than was strictly necessary. You must let him believe you are afraid, that you have come to plead. He must think he has power over you again. Men like Millstone expose themselves when they believe themselves victorious. So I go to him as the woman he thinks he remembers, Anne said, and hope that the woman I have become does not shatter in the process. His hand twitched, as if he wanted to reach for her, and held himself in check. You will not shatter. You cannot know that, she said. His eyes met hers with an intensity that left no room for retreat. I know you. You are the woman who walked into a ballroom knowing she would be despised and held her head high. The woman who faced down Harrington in that shabby parlor and sent him packing. The woman who has rebuilt a household in 3 months and commanded the respect of people who do not give it lightly. You will not shatter, Anne. You may crack, you may rage, you may weep afterward, but you will not break. Her throat burned. And if I say I cannot do this, then we find another way, he said without hesitation. I will never compel you. I will deal with him by other means, and we will weather the storm together, however ugly it becomes. Your consent is not a formality I require. It is the axis on which my conscience turns. It was the most revealing thing he had ever said to her. She turned away for a moment, walking to the window. The park lay before her, the same park she had studied from her modest lodging in London when Frederick first made his proposal. Then she had been choosing between scandal and survival. Now she was choosing what kind of life her survival would buy. She saw a flash of movement outside, a groom leading a horse, a maid crossing the yard with an armful of linens. People whose lives would go on whatever she did, yet whose fates were tied in some small way to the steadiness of this house. She thought of Margaret, writing breathless letters about her upcoming marriage and her delight in having a duchess for an elder sister. She thought of a future child, imagined, not yet real, who would grow up knowing only this version of their mother, not the shattered creature Arthur had once tried to fashion. Slowly, she turned back. I will go, she said. I will meet him. But we do this on our terms, not his. He will not see a frightened girl crawling back to beg. He will see a duchess who has learned the value of her own name. Frederick's features shifted. Something like pride, something like fear, something like love flickering there before he masked it. He stepped closer and took her hands in his, slowly enough that she could have pulled away. She did not. I do not deserve you, he said quietly. That is a fortunate symmetry, she replied, attempting lightness and nearly managing it. I am not entirely sure I deserve you either. He lifted one of her hands and pressed his lips to her knuckles. The contact was brief but steady. You matter, he said, more than I thought it was still possible for someone to matter to me. Remember that in the room with him. Whatever he says, whatever he throws at you, remember that his words are wind. Mine will stand. Her eyes stung. And what are your words? You are my wife, he said. My equal. My choice. Not my mistake. Not my obligation. Mine, because I wish you to be. It was a dangerous thing to hear. A glorious, terrifying thing. She nodded once because if she tried to speak she would cry. The hotel room chosen for the meeting was respectable, discreet, and entirely without charm. It might have been anywhere in England, or nowhere at all. Neutral ground, Frederick's solicitor had called it. Anne arrived with only her maid and Frederick's man as escort. Frederick himself entered first by another door, slipping into the adjoining chamber where a thin wall and a small, cleverly placed vent would carry every word to him. It was a risk. They could have arranged to watch from behind a screen, but that would have been too easily discovered. This way, Arthur would believe himself in complete control. The solicitor made a point of greeting Anne in the corridor, his careful courtesy as much performance as politeness, then withdrawing to a farther end of the suite. Anne stood alone when Arthur was shown in. He looked older than she remembered, not markedly, but enough. Slight hollows beneath his eyes, a tightness at the corners of his mouth. The fashionable cut of his coat could not disguise a faint air of strain, as if luck had begun, at last, to turn its back on him. For the first time, she did not flinch at the sight of him. "Anne," he said, closing the door behind him. "Or must I call you Your Grace now to satisfy your pretensions?" "That would be proper," she said. Her voice emerged steady, almost bored. "But I suppose propriety is a flexible concept for a man who has filed a frivolous petition with the court in order to harass his former wife." His jaw tightened. "Is that what Moore told you to say?" "No one tells me what to say," she replied. "Not anymore." His gaze raked her, searching for fear. He found composure instead and did not like it. "You are bold," he said. "Bolder than you were when you left my house sniveling about your delicate feelings. Marriage to you was killing me," she said. "Leaving was an act of survival, not sentiment." He moved closer, hands clasped behind his back. "And yet here you are, come to plead with me. I confess, I did not expect to enjoy this as much as I am." "Enjoy it while you can," she said. "The pleasure will be brief." He laughed, harsh and humorless. "You think your new title protects you? That being Ashton's wife puts you beyond my reach? The law does not bend for dukes any more than it does for commoners. You were my wife first. That gives me leverage." "It gives you a history," Anne replied. "Not leverage." "You always believed yourself cleverer than you are," he said. "Your separation was granted because certain details were glossed over. Your solicitor was not as careful as he pretended. The right questions asked at the right time could make everything unravel." "And whose fault would that be?" she asked. "Mine, or the solicitor's, or yours, for forcing the separation in the first place with your cruelty?" His nostrils flared. "You always dramatized. A few raised voices, a bit of discipline, and suddenly you were the heroine of your own tragedy." "A few raised voices," she echoed, incredulous. "You isolated me, threatened me, used my father's memory as a weapon to keep me compliant. You orchestrated the sale of my home and smugly watched as everything I loved was stripped away to feed your ambitions. That is not discipline. That is abuse." "You would not know abuse if you saw it," he scoffed. "Moore has wrapped you up in silk and flattery. You are too dazzled to see that he uses you as much as I ever did. We are not so different, he and I." "You are wrong," she said. "About him, about me, about almost everything as it happens. You always have been." He took another step forward, lowering his voice. "You think he married you out of some noble impulse? He saw a chance to wound me publicly and seized it. You were a convenient instrument, that is all." "I was convenient to you as well," she said. "And yet here we stand and only one of us has managed to build something from the ruins you left behind. Tell me, Arthur, did filing that petition feel like victory, or like begging the law to confirm you still matter to someone who has long since ceased to think of you at all?" For a flicker of a moment, she saw it, that flash of wounded pride, raw and unmasked. "You will always think of me," he snarled, "every time someone whispers that your marriage might be invalid. Every time you wonder whether your children are legitimate, every time you walk into a room and feel eyes on you. You will know I am there even when I am not. I did once, she said. You haunted me. You invaded my thoughts, my sleep, my very sense of self. But that was before I remembered who I was, before I chose to become someone you could never have married, because you would have been too afraid. Afraid? He repeated, incredulous. Yes, she said, afraid of a woman who would stand in front of you like this, who would tell you to your face that you are small, that all your schemes and cruelty have made you less, not more. He lunged then, not with a fist but with words sharpened to draw blood. Do you imagine Moore loves you? He spat. He is incapable of it. He is cold down to the marrow. He told everyone as much years ago when Lydia Hartwell jilted him. You are a symbol, Anne, a useful emblem of his power. Nothing more. Pain pricked, because some part of that had once been dangerously close to true. But she had the memory of Frederick's voice in her mind. You matter. More than I thought it was still possible for someone to matter to me. He did not love me when we married, she said. We both knew that. What we did not know was what might grow out of respect and truth. You think love is what you claimed it to be when you courted me, flowers and flattering words and empty promises. It is not. Love is waking every day next to someone who sees you clearly and chooses you anyway. You have never done that for anyone. No one has ever done it for you. That is your tragedy, Arthur, not mine. His face darkened. You cannot stand there and claim to love him, he said. You who ran from one marriage, now pretending the second is some grand romance. It is laughable. I am not laughing, she said. And I did not run from marriage. I ran from you. There is a difference I am glad no longer needs legal definition, only moral. He snarled a curse. You speak as if you are untouchable, as if my petition has no teeth. It does not, she said, because your own teeth are rotten. You have built your fortunes on deception. Do you truly believe my husband, who sees the world in ledgers and contracts as much as in titles and votes, would marry me without examining every document connected to my past? He knows precisely how our separation was obtained. He also knows what you have been doing since. His bravado faltered. What I have been doing? Forging signatures, she said, ticking off on her fingers, pressuring desperate men into lopsided deals, creating debts where none previously existed, coercing a clerk to alter a contract after it was signed. Those are the things you have been doing, Arthur, and those are the things my husband can prove. You are bluffing, he said, but the confidence had bled out of the words. Am I? She asked quietly. Ask yourself who has more resources, the man who must file baseless petitions to get anyone to look his way, or the Duke whose favor ministers court. Do you think the courts would be more interested in your wounded pride over a separation long past, or in the evidence of fraud and corruption tied to government contracts? Color drained from his cheeks. He would not risk his own name in such a fight. He would risk anything to protect what is his, Anne said. I know that now. He has told me as much, and when he speaks he does not lie. Withdraw your petition today, before it reaches ears that will do more than whisper about it. You are threatening me, he said. Yes, she answered. For the first and last time. I have run out of patience for being your victim. He stared at her, tearing at her composure with his gaze, searching for fear enough to push him into one more reckless act. What he found instead was a steadiness forged in rooms like this, in nights when she had learned to talk herself out of despair. You think you have won, he said at last, bitter. You and your Duke. You stand there with your title and your fine clothes and pretend you are something more than a woman who climbed into a better bed. Anger flared, hot and clean, but she did not let it dictate her response. I am more, she said quietly, because I chose that bed. I chose that man. I chose this life. You never understood choice, you only understood control. That is why you have lost, Arthur. Not because a duke humiliated you in a ballroom, but because you never knew how to build anything that did not require someone else's ruin. He took an unsteady breath. If I withdraw, he will still come for me, he said. That is the sort of man he is. If you withdraw, she said, we will go on with our lives and allow you the mercy of obscurity. Continue, and you will learn how merciless we can be when pushed. It is the only mercy you will ever receive from this house. Take it or do not. But understand that no one will rescue you from what follows." He stared at her for a long, taut moment. Then he spat a vulgar word, turned and strode to the door. She did not watch him leave. She kept her eyes on the empty chair he had vacated until she heard the door close and the echo of his footsteps recede. Only then did she let herself breathe. The adjoining door opened almost at once. Frederick crossed the room in 3 strides and was at her side before she could straighten fully. "Anne." Her name on his lips sounded like both a prayer and an oath. She looked up. "Did he say enough?" "He said more than enough," Frederick replied grimly. "We have him in his own words, admitting motive and hinting at knowledge of his illegal dealings. My solicitor could not have planned a more fruitful conversation." "Then it is finished," she said. "One way or another." "Yes," he said, "it is finished." The strength went out of her knees all at once. Before she could collapse, he caught her, his arms solid around her, drawing her against his chest, as if he had been born for the task. "You were extraordinary," he murmured against her hair. "I have never been more proud of anyone in my life." Tears burned, then spilled, soaking into his coat. He could have ruined everything. "He could have tried," Frederick said. "But he did not, because you faced him down and you did not yield an inch." She clutched at his lapels. "I was so afraid that I would become that woman again, the one he could reduce with a single word." "You will never be that woman again," he said fiercely. "Not while I draw breath. Not while you remember who you are." "And who am I?" she whispered. His hands gentled, one rising to cradle the back of her head. "You are Anne," he said. "My wife. The Duchess of Ashton. The woman who walked out of that marriage because her soul demanded better, and who had the courage to try again. A woman who built a home out of broken pieces and had the audacity to offer me a place in it." She pulled back just enough to see his face. His eyes were bright, the cool blue deepened by emotion. "I love you," he said. "I thought love was something other men wasted themselves on. I told myself respect and duty were enough. But you, damn you, Anne, have made me see that there is strength in loving someone who has already proved she can survive without you." A broken laugh escaped her. "You choose the strangest compliments." "They are the only kind I know how to give," he replied. "I love you too," she said. "I started seeing you as my ally, then my friend. Somewhere between the library and the nights you came to my room and asked before touching me, something shifted. I tried to ignore it. I was afraid. But I'm more afraid now of pretending it is not there." He closed his eyes briefly, as if absorbing the words like light. "Then let us stop pretending," he said. "Let us make this marriage what society already believes it to be. Not a bargain, but a union. With contracts and negotiations still," she said, because she could not help herself. "I have grown used to having terms." He smiled, a slow, genuine curve that altered his whole face. "Very well. I propose the following revisions. No more speaking of our marriage as merely practical. No more dividing our lives into what is duty and what is feeling. You are entitled to every corner of this house and every corner of my heart. I reserve the right to worry excessively whenever you place yourself in danger. In exchange, I accept that you will go on terrifying me with your courage." "And what do I receive?" she asked, tears drying on her cheeks, her voice unsteady but light. "Everything that is mine," he said simply. "My name, my protection, my respect, my admiration, my stubbornness, my foolish attempts at humor, my love, Anne, for as long as you will have it." She pretended to consider. "Those terms," she said at last, "are acceptable, with one addition." "Name it," he said. "You are entitled," she said, "to worry excessively. But you must also allow me to worry for you. You are not the only one in this marriage allowed to be terrified." He laughed, low and startled, and pulled her into another embrace. "Done." Arthur withdrew his petition 3 days later. The official notice came stamped and sealed, couched in legal language that attempted to disguise defeat as reconsideration. Within a fortnight, word reached them that he had left England, his passage booked for the continent under a false name no one bothered to remember correctly. Society did what it always did. It speculated, it embroidered, it moved on. The story that gained the most traction was not of a bigamy petition vanished in silence, but of a scoundrel quietly forced out of respectable circles by a duke whose temper was never seen but always felt. Anne's name lay largely untouched in the tide of gossip that followed. At most, there were murmurs of her remarkable composure and newfound serenity. No one spoke of the hotel room. No one but Anne and Frederick ever knew what words had been exchanged there. Spring in Northumberland arrived in earnest that year, later than in the south, but with a vigour that made up for the delay. Trees burst into leaf almost overnight. Lambs dotted the fields beyond the park. The walled garden Anne had studied in winter became her favourite place, a living testament to the fact that old soil could bear new growth. One afternoon, she walked there with a hand resting unconsciously at her middle. The movement had become a habit in recent weeks, born of wonder as much as caution. "You will wear the path away if you keep this up," Frederick said from behind her. She turned, smiling. "You sound like Mrs. Winters." "Mrs. Winters has learned that scolding me is futile," he replied, coming to her side. "She has therefore transferred her efforts to you, a sign that she considers you the more reasonable of us." "I tremble beneath the weight of such responsibility," Anne said. He glanced at her hand, then laid his own gently over it. The warmth of his palm sank through the fabric of her gown to the new, delicate life beneath. "Has Dr. Abernathy said anything to trouble you?" he asked. "You have seemed quiet since his visit." "Nothing to trouble," she said softly, "only that he believes I must rest more often than I like, and avoid unnecessary journeys, and relinquish any foolish ideas about personally supervising repairs to tenant roofs." "I confess myself entirely in sympathy with all three recommendations," Frederick said, "particularly the last." "Coward," she murmured. "Pragmatist," he corrected. "I only just succeeded in convincing you to build a future with me. I am disinclined to see you tumble off a ladder before our child is born." "Our child." The words still sent a tremor through her, not because they frightened her, but because they seemed almost too large to fit inside her chest. "Do you realize," she said, "that there will be a person in this house who never knew me as anything but your wife, who will grow up thinking it normal that a duchess once stood in a ballroom and faced down a room ready to devour her?" "Our child," he said, "will grow up thinking it normal that his mother or her mother is the bravest person they know." "Bravery," she said wryly, "is often just fear with no better options." "And yet," he said, "you have never allowed fear to make you small. That distinction matters." She leaned against him, letting his arm wrap around her shoulders. The garden spread before them, colour slowly returning to beds that had once been bare. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked suddenly. "That you chose me in that ballroom? That you tied yourself to my scandal when you might have married someone easier?" He was quiet for a long moment. A bird sang somewhere nearby, the sound sharp and hopeful. "I regret," he said finally, "that I took so long in life to make one truly courageous choice, but I do not regret the choice itself, not for a heartbeat." She closed her eyes, letting the words soak into spaces that had once been hollowed by Arthur's cruelty. "You did not choose me for love," she said, "at least not then." "No," he agreed. "I chose you because you were wounded and furious and too proud to beg, because it offended me to see cruelty rewarded, because I saw an opportunity to strike at a man I despised and protect someone he had tried to destroy." "And now?" she asked. "And now," he said, "I love you so completely that I cannot remember what it felt like to walk into a room and not instinctively look for you. My reasons have expanded." She laughed softly. "Mine too. I began by choosing you out of desperation, then out of respect, then out of a growing sense that, if I were ever to risk my heart again, it would be with a man who knew exactly how sharp it was. Now I choose you simply because you are you." He kissed her temple. "Then we are well matched in our foolishness." They stood together for a while, watching bees explore the first blossoms. "Do you ever think of him?" Frederick asked at last. He did not need to name Arthur. "Sometimes," she said honestly, "but not as I once did. There was a time when merely hearing his name made my heart race and my thoughts scatter. Now when I think of him, it is distant. like remembering a nightmare one knows cannot return. It is no longer about what he did to me. It is about who he failed to become. A better man, Frederick said. Yes, she replied, and I pity him for that. But I no longer fear him. That is the greatest difference. He exhaled, as if releasing a tension he had carried as long as she had. Then we have truly won. We, she echoed. I like that you always say we. I could not have done any of it without you, he said. And you, I suspect, might have found another path. But it would not have led here. I am selfish enough to be grateful that you chose this one. She rested her hand again on her abdomen, his still covering it. So am I, she said. In time, London's version of their story settled into something almost mythic. People spoke of that ball in hushed, delighted tones, how a cruel man had mocked a woman for her ruined reputation, and how a duke had silenced him with a single request for a waltz. They embroidered details, as people always did. Some claimed the orchestra had fallen entirely silent until Frederick spoke. Others insisted that Anne's gown had been torn, her humiliation more visible than it truly was. A few swore that Arthur had tried to protest the engagement at once and been publicly rebuked. No two retellings agreed, but all shared one core image. A woman on the verge of social annihilation, plucked from the abyss by a man with enough power to make society rewrite its own script. They rarely mentioned in those stories the tedious work that followed. The letters, the household reforms, the negotiations with tenants and ministers, the quiet nights in a North Country library where two people learned how to speak honestly without flinching. That was all right. Those details did not belong to the world. They belonged to Anne and Frederick alone. Once, at a small dinner party years later, Annie, Duchess of Ashton, mother to two sturdy children and expecting a third, overheard a young lady sigh to a friend. "Imagine," the girl whispered, "being so ruined that only a duke would dare marry you." Anne smiled into her wineglass and said nothing. If the girl wished to wrap romance in neat, gilded phrases, that was her right. Life would teach her its own nuance in time. Beside her, Frederick's hand found hers beneath the table. His thumb drew an idle circle against her wrist, grounding her in the present as easily as it had once steadied her in a chaotic ballroom. "Thinking treasonous thoughts," he murmured without looking at her. "Only that people tell stories the way they need to hear them," she replied, "not always the way they happened." "And how would you tell ours?" he asked. She considered. "I would say that once a cruel voice asked, 'Who would marry a woman like you?' And the answer turned out to be a man who understood that a woman's worth is not measured by a spotless past, but by what she does with her scars." "Poetic," he said, "suspiciously so. Are you quite sure you did not marry me for my library alone?" "It was a consideration," she said, "but in the end, I suppose I stayed for the man inside it." He squeezed her hand, and that was all. Later, walking back to their carriage under a sky littered with stars, she thought again of that old question. It no longer hurt. It no longer belonged to Arthur or to the people who had once nodded along in secret agreement. It belonged to her answer. Who would marry a woman like her? A duke, yes, but more importantly, a man who chose her not to save her reputation, but to share his life. A man who had learned alongside her that love born of truth and tested in fire could be more enduring than any pretty story told in a drawing room. That was the ending no one in that first ballroom could have predicted. And that, she thought, was precisely why it was worth telling. Dear listeners of Echoes of Romance, thank you from the heart for staying with Anne and Frederick through every wound, every waltz, and every hard-won choice. If this story moved you, please take a moment to subscribe. Leave a kind comment sharing what touched you most and like this episode. And of course, activate notifications so you never miss another tale of second chances, quiet courage, and unexpected love. Your presence here keeps these echoes of romance alive.